Well, everybody, how's things? I hope you're all doing okay, and welcome to my channel. This is a new type of video I'm doing. It's called Uncharted Histories, and during these type of videos, we'll be uncovering all different types of under-researched topics throughout history. But first of all, if you're new to my channel, thanks so much for joining, and if you haven't done so already, please don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe and stuff like that. I'd really appreciate it. Again, if you haven't come across my channels before, my name's Peter. I am a social media content creator of like over 230,000 followers on TikTok, but my YouTube's starting to slowly grow. I'm near up to 5,000. And because I am nearing 5,000, I thought I would use my platforms to hopefully grow as a historian. I am also a historian as well. I specialise in mainly Thatcher's Britain, so topics like the poll tax, policy development, Thatcherism, inequalities, and stuff like that. But I've also a wide range of history interests such as Irish history, museum history, and to be honest, I have a passion for all different types of history, all different types of historical topics as well. And I just want to incorporate something or a part of my channel uh, dedicated to history, basically. And this is what I'm hoping to do with this Uncharted Histories series, which will allow me to hopefully bring my interests and historical interests to wider audiences, but also I'm hoping to get other contributors, like specialists in their fields, to bring their topics of interest and passions to my channel, so people can get to learn exactly fields of history that they mightn't have came across before. And this is why I come up and develop this channel and series, Uncharted Histories. And as I said, mainly what this series will do is we'll explore the often underlooked and under-researched topics in history that you possibly haven't heard of, or probably limited knowledge about, or very well-known topics. It will also be used to bring a new look or a new angle towards very prominent subjects and topics that might enlighten new knowledge and might bring you a new different look at probably famous topics out there, historical topics. So this is what I hope to do, and I hope to do one of these videos, if possible, one every fortnight. But definitely, you'll be seeing quite a lot of these videos coming forward, and the main type of thing is to basically, hopefully, to stimulate interests from my audience and followers, and to allow my channel to be a platform for historians and academics alike to read for the research to spread. And if you have any topics of interest that you would like me to expand upon, please just let me know in the chat. No topics really off limits, really. I'm willing to give anything a go. But without any further ado, we might as well just get into the first topic of interest in this Uncharted series. And as you can possibly see here, my head's basically covering the bit at the end there. But the first topic is related to an area of research that I've done myself, and it is climate change policy under Margaret Thatcher. Um, as you all know, as I'm sure you all are very aware, climate change is a very topical topic at present. Um, and especially in modern times, the topic's always on the news and stuff like that. Um, but the topic was sort of under researched in particular and started to gain prominence. Or sorry, the topic was under researched in relation to Margaret Thatcher, but climate change as a policy and firmly became to be developed and pushed onto the governmental agenda, especially during Thatcher's third administration as Prime Minister in Great Britain. And I do believe it was a topic, and still is a topic, that warrants a great deal of research and awareness. Hence why this is what I attempted to do I took this research in my master's dissertation. Um, and hence today's video will explore what I found related to Margaret Thatcher's climate change policy during basically her third administration between 1987 and 1990, and hopefully it will look at stimulating a bit of interest in climate change as a topic, but also enlighten you to a topic that's often underlooked in regards to Thatcher herself, which was climate change policy. So just a bit of an overview before we start what today's basically video will cover. It will cover how climate change policy and how climate change problems originally came on the governmental agenda and how it was pushed forward onto Thatcher's agenda during her third administration. It will look at the type of solutions actively being pushed forward and proposed by various people to Thatcher and her cabinet to basically as a remedy to climate change and global warming. It will also look at Margaret Thatcher's own views on the solutions and climate change. And finally, it will look at what climate change policies Thatcher's government actually did go on to implement pertaining to climate change and how such policies compared to others during this time, other countries that is. So that is what we'll look at today. And I hope you find it interesting because I did when I was researching it. But yeah, before we do start, it's important, before we get into like Thatcher and climate change policy and stuff, I have to give a bit of background information on whom Thatcher actually is in this period in Britain, because I am aware that even though she is a very well-known figure, there may be people watching this that possibly don't know who she actually is. So yeah, without any further ado, let's get into it. Firstly, to cut a long story short, she was Britain's first female prime minister, and she actually lasted 3 administrations or terms as prime minister between 1979 and November 1990, when she had to resign as prime minister. Dude, I'm not going to get into that today. That's what my other poll tax and stuff's on. But yeah, she resigned in November 1990. Her reign was actually the longest reign as prime minister in over a century. And even though she won 3 consecutive British general elections throughout her entire tenure, she was and still remains a very highly controversial and divisive figure in Britain, Ireland, and indeed worldwide. On the one hand, as you can see by the slides here, on the one hand, she is lauded and she is praised as being one of the best British prime ministers since Winston Churchill for breaking down barriers for women in politics, for restoring Britain's status in the world, and also for her role in helping bring about the end of the Cold War. For instance, she stimulated a lot of talks around with Gorbachev and stuff like that. So she is lauded in that regard. But on the other hand, she is vilified, and I'm not going to be shy in saying this, she is actually hated and detested in many regards for various things. For instance, widening inequalities, destroying the miners and the trade unions, igniting trouble and violence and hatred within Scotland and Ireland / Northern Ireland, and also for her staunch resistance and reluctance to give in to various things, which often led to a lot of people and her being labelled as the Iron Lady. Therefore, given the controversy surrounding Thatcher, it isn't surprising to know that she is very widely researched, and there is a whole lot of topical discussion and academia out there related to Thatcher on various topics. For instance, Thatcherism, race, economic policy, domestic and international relations, local government, which I am sort of doing at present. All these type of topics have been covered by various academics, showing how controversial she is as a figure, but also, how influential her period as prime minister actually was for good or for bad. And her legacy is still very prominent today, and her impact is still having big impacts in today's world. So yeah, it cannot be doubted Thatcher is a very prominent historical figure. Having said that, though, despite being the highly researched figure that she is, one topic that was and still is criminally under-researched, which is why I did take it for my master's dissertation, was her and Britain's role in advancing climate change policy. And that was actually very surprising to me when I first came upon this, considering that Thatcher herself actually did have a chemistry degree, which she got at Somerville College, Oxford. And although other environmental issues associated with Thatcher have been widely researched, for instance, ozone depletion, for instance, climate change policy was often overlooked, to be honest. And that's why I get heavily invested in this topic. And that's what I'm going to do for you today. Because most historians and academics agree that between the years 1987 and 1990, climate change policy did emerge more prominently onto the governmental agenda in Britain. And this is what I will hopefully enlighten you to within this wee video. So yeah, here we go, folks. This is basically the start of like the new information that I'm going to bring. But yeah, let's get into it. Well, yeah, as I says, as I already discussed, the emergence of climate change as a topic, as already mentioned, did begin to occupy a more prominent role on Thatcher's governmental agenda and Britain's governmental agenda during Thatcher's third administration. The reason for this was because of various mitigating circumstances that pushed the topic onto the governmental agenda, more or less because the topic was demanding greater awareness and also greater governmental attention at the time. And the type of circumstances that really pushed this climate change onto the agenda, there was a few of them. Firstly, there was increased awareness of the potential threats of climate change around this time. For instance, the atmospheric modelling conducted by Working Group 1 of the Intergovernmental Panel of Climate Change, a forum that was established in 1988 by the United Nations Environment Programme and the World Meteorological Organization, demonstrated that increased concentrations of greenhouse gases like carbon dioxide within the atmosphere would likely cause global mean temperatures to rise by 0.3 degrees Celsius every decade, would likely cause a 6 centimeter rise in sea levels every 10 years, and this could actually potentially stimulate a drastic change in the UK's seasonal weather patterns. Not only was this starting to strike fear because of the potential weather effects this could have, it was creating concerns in regards to other areas as well. For instance, the UK Cabinet warned in April 1989 that rising sea levels because of climate change and because of the agricultural problems associated with global warming could create global food shortages for Britain, as well as increase defence finances by up to £5 billion per year to build various sea defences to basically stop the effects of climate change. Therefore, can be no doubt that panic was beginning to set in at this time, that global warming and climate change could have potentially devastating effects, long-term especially, for Great Britain. And no doubt this warning was often heightened by recent events at the time that often pushed this warning firmly onto the mindsets of various people. For instance, events such as the 1988 US 7-week drought, which caused $60 billion worth of agricultural damages, the October 1987 British storm of the century, which resulted in casualties and millions of trees being destroyed, the devastating 1987 and the 1988 Bangladesh floods, as well as the fact that 4 of the previous 7 UK summers were actually the warmest on record. Therefore, these type of worries were pushing the agenda and the fear that climate change was already here and that the problems needed to be addressed very soon. On top of this increasing awareness about the potential threats posed by climate change, there was also increased worry setting in at this time pertaining to the fact that there was an awareness that Britain were very over-reliant and dependent on fossil fuels for their energy. To this end, energy from power stations, especially electricity, consumed 37% of all UK CO2 emissions at this time, whilst road transport produced 16% of emissions, but were due drastically to increase in the near future by up to 23 to 47%, with increasing predictions due to road traffic. So they were heavily reliant in this regard on fossil fuels for their energy consumption, and there was an increasing awareness of this field. Thus, there was demands beginning to set in, and worry, to be honest, that Britain had to develop and come up with ways to possibly stop and curtail, on the one hand, the rising threat posed by climate change, but on the other hand, without hindering the social and economic goals of Thatcherism, because CO2 levels, as we've already seen, were Britain was increasingly dependent on CO2 for their energy consumption. Thus, combating this dual threat, so to speak, began to make or occupy a real grasp over the governmental policy, especially within the environmental department at this time. Having said that, though, building on from these 2 points, and these 2 points did evidently push climate change onto Thatcher and her government's agenda, there were other domestic and international developments that also contributed to the rise of climate change onto the policy agenda at this stage. Firstly, there was a growing rise and development at this time of the environmental lobby, which were basically environmental pressure groups pushing the agenda about the possible warnings and threats associated with climate change. And such parties, environmental lobbies at this time, began to make greater noise. And in particular, the greatest example of this was the rise of the Green Party. Not only did the Green Party and its candidates poll 10% of the votes in a Hackney borough by-election in June 1987, but the Green Party itself actually took a 14.5% share of the UK votes in the first past the post European elections of 1989. Therefore, you could argue that Thatcher and her party were evidently realizing at this time that environmental issues were potentially proven to be a vote winner, so they had to join the party, so to speak, and keep up with other Green parties to potentially win votes. On top of the environmental lobby, there was also the growth of developing countries at this time, namely China, Brazil, and India. Such countries' economic developments were growing steadily fast, and Britain felt they had a moral obligation to not only encourage this economic growth, but more importantly, to protect their future economic, trade, and agricultural deals. So they had to they felt that a moral obligation to intervene to find a way to not only continually help these countries develop from an economic standpoint, potentially using climate change as an avenue to instill neoliberal ideals, but at the same time to protect their own interests by ensuring that the real threats of climate change remained unchecked. Thus, this is what they wanted to do and attempted to do, but it was a dual problem that was causing, at this time, a lot of headaches because people didn't know what to really do. As Sir Geoffrey Howe, the Secretary of State for Foreign and Commonwealth Affairs at this time, and former Chancellor of the Exchequer, he labelled it a crisis of Malthusian proportions, because it was almost impossible to control the damaging climate activities of these countries on the one hand, whilst remaining sensitive to their economic development needs on the other. Thus, there was like a double-edged sword, so to speak, where Britain had to like curtail climate change, but didn't want to curtail the economic growth of these countries. So that was another reason to push on the agenda. Further afield, however, there were two other international developments that no doubt aided the arrival of global warming onto Thatcher's policy agenda at this time. Firstly, there was the arrival of President George Bush. George Bush, unlike his predecessor Ronald Reagan, who was a very close ally and friend to Thatcher, Bush seemed to be a concerted environmentalist and aimed to tackle environmental degradation and global warming. Not only were environmental concerns central to his election campaign of 1988, but even during a speech to the IPCC in March 1990, Bush promised to plant 1 billion trees and spend £1 billion in research development to combat the greenhouse effect. In addition to Bush, however, another international development no doubt proved really to stimulate the rise of climate change. And this was a growing international and European ambition to either strengthen the UNEP or to create, and this is specifically the point, to create a set of new legally binding institutions to help reduce global CO2 emissions. The most ambitious, and especially pertaining to Thatcher's point of view, contentious development to this avenue was the potential development of a new international organisation known as GLOBE, which was proposed by French Prime Minister Michel Rocard. I can never pronounce that name, but yeah, Michel Rocard. He proposed this at a conference in The Hague in March 1989. GLOBE was not only seeking to implement regulatory measures upon countries, including imposing economic sanctions for countries who failed to meet emission targets, but also wanted each nation in this new international organisation to declare and sign a declaration to transfer all their legislative powers pertaining to climate change to the organisation itself. Consequently, in response to this possible threat of this new international organisation, GLOBE, which could potentially hinder the Thatcherite economic agenda, British governmental figures, Thatcher herself, and others decided it would be best to push climate change matters further within existing arrangements and in turn strengthen the existing institutions and not to develop new ones that could potentially hinder the Thatcherite economic agenda. As Nicholas Ridley, who was at this time the Secretary of State for the Environment in the Department of Environment in the UK in May 1989 stated, the government would not counterbalance another supranation body like the EEC. Therefore, it could be no doubt that this, alongside these other measures, firmly put climate change onto Thatcher's governmental agenda at this stage. Therefore, given the arrival of climate change on, the screen just fell there. Therefore, given the arrival of climate change onto the agenda at this time, what were the type of proposals being put forward to mitigate the climate crisis, whilst maintain the Thatcherite agenda domestically and international? Well, to this end, according to my research, there were a number of suggestions put forward, but in the main, there seemed to be 5. 2 domestic solutions and 3 international solutions. Firstly, regarding the 2 domestic solutions, the first one to be put forward was to promote greater energy efficiency. Dr. Ken Curry, who was the head of the Energy Technology Support Unit, for instance, claimed to an all-day climate change seminar in 1989 with the Cabinet that if Britain were to exercise all available measures pertaining to energy efficiency, for instance, pricing controls, distribution of advice, investment in research and design, increased regulations, and subsidies, the country could possibly achieve 40% of its 2020 CO2 target, which was a 130 million tonnes reduction in CO2, but also, on the other hand, maintain a healthy 2.25 per annum level of economic growth. This was the first proposal that was pitched forward, or the first main proposal to be pitched forward. The most contentious element associated with this was, however, for the policy in Greece to really put forward significant greater energy efficiency measures, there had to be an inclusion of a so-called carbon tax, which was being put forward by economists such as David Pearce of the University College London. And this would prove very controversial to Thatcher and for her supporters within her party, because they believed it would hinder Great Britain's competitiveness in the market compared to other countries. So this was to prove a real contentious issue. Domestically, the second solution on a domestic level to be pitched forward at this time was to increase Britain's nuclear capacity. And to be fair, I would argue this was the preferred solution. And this was basically pitched forward by the UK's Atomic Energy Authority, who, via various documents which were distributed to schools, MPs, and 500 companies up and including the year 1990, pitched forward the idea that if Britain's nuclear capacity was increased from its current, at this stage, so 1989 level of 16.5% to 50%, domestic energy generated CO2 emission levels would be reduced by 30% because of the widespread decrease of fossil fuel dependency. The UK's Central Electricity Generating Board, for instance, also planned and pressurised that they could pitch forward the idea to develop and construct 4 pressurized reactor nuclear power stations before the year 2000, including power stations at Sizewell B and Hinkley Point. Despite this being the seemingly most preferred option by a lot of MPs within Thatcher's party and Thatcher herself, there were and did seem to be a lot of drawbacks with this solution, however. For instance, Timothy Jackson of the Stockholm Environment Institute in London at the Hinkley Point inquiry in June 1990, for instance, submitted evidence from Friends of the Earth, which showed that at a cost of over £20 a tonne of carbon saved, nuclear generating power came only 15th out of 17th compared with other solutions widely available to policymakers at this time. Similarly, in a paper distributed to Rocky Mountain Institute in November 1988, this paper demonstrated that for nuclear power to even make a dent against the greenhouse effect, it would require power stations to be built at a speed of 1 every 3 days for decades. Therefore, given these details, and even though it was the most supported option, this solution seemingly made little economic and environmental sense to be pursued at this stage. Nevertheless, these were the 2 main solutions being pitched at this time towards Thatcher and her cabinet from various actors. Having said that, in addition to the domestic solutions, there were 3 main international solutions being pitched forward to Thatcher and her party at this stage. The first one was increasing Britain's modelling capacity. There were a lot of experts, such as like Crispin Tickle, Chief Scientific Officer for the Department of Environment, were pitching the idea and proposals for Britain to increase their investment and awareness into scientific research initiatives pertaining to atmospheric and oceanic modelling. John Fairclough, the Chief Scientific Officer to the Department of Environment, in collaboration with the Director General of the MEDO, the Chairman of the National Environment Research Council, and as well as the Science Engineering Research Council, recommended that a new modelling centre to be based on the existing site of the MEDO would provide not only a sound scientific basis to make future policy decisions concerning the possible impacts of climate change upon specific regions, but would also lead to increased international collaboration because of exchanges in data and scientific experts. They believed at a small cost of £3 to £4 million per year, this solution was too great an opportunity to turn down because it provided Britain with both political and strategic benefits. So yeah, the first one was an increased willingness to pursue modelling initiatives. The second one, on the other hand, internationally, was greater reforestation efforts. Advisors such as George Gayes and cabinet ministers including Sir Geoffrey Howe, for example, presupposed that the UK should embark on a large-scale reforestation international programme within such developing countries to protect tropical rainforests by locking up carbon. The most controversial solution put forward to this end, however, came via industrialist Sir James Goldsmith. Goldsmith's plan for saving rainforests at this time consisted of the UK establishing a new international organisation called ForestCo, which would enter into contracts with the host nations, so the developing nations, whereby the host nation, for an annual payment of predetermined debt, would undertake to protect their forests for the good of all countries, not just their own. Payment would be in the form of international debt at par value issued by the host nations, and such debt would be acquired by ForestCo through the mark or bilateral transactions with banks and creditors. Therefore, this was basically an initiative that was basically putting forward a measure of conditionality, whereby Britain would implement and instill a global reforestation program within developing countries in return, so to speak, for these developing countries to pursue and help the neoliberal principles of the worldwide neoliberal economic agenda. And finally, the third international solution being pitched forward at this stage was to address the possible problem of free riders in the market, which was basically to stop and curtail the rise of globe and to really stop a legally binding law of the atmosphere, so to speak, to being pursued. Sir Crispin Tickell, Britain's ambassador to the UN, for example, advocated that Britain should pursue a framework similar to the Montreal Protocol because it would allow for a loosely agreed set of climate change protocols to be established that would protect the planet and maintain sustainable economic growth. There was also a move at the top level and being pitched forward at this time to propose that the UN Security Council should have a role in strengthening this proposal. They believed that this would help the US in develop their own policy and as well as China, but the Security Council would have oversight to the subject to set up its own commission to instill measures to the benefit of the Council and indeed the UNEP institutions. Therefore, they would have oversight of any future climate change policies. So really important. Therefore, with all these policies on the table at this stage being put forward to mitigate possible climate change impacts, what were the policies going to be taken forward as the official British policy towards climate change? This is what we will discuss. But first, it's very important to emphasize what was Thatcher's view on climate change and what policies she did support, because I do think this helps enlighten what policies that actually Britain did go on to pursue. Therefore, without any further ado, let's get into Thatcher's own views. Firstly, it is important to say she was actually an avid proponent of climate change, and it is very important to acknowledge this. As he stated in a speech to the UN General Assembly in 1989, for instance, "We are not the Lord's, we are the Lord's creatures, the trustees of this planet, charged today with preserving life itself, preserving life with all its mystery and its wonder." Hence, during especially her third administration, she was actively pushing climate change initiatives, and in doing so, she was supportive of a lot of the proposals being put forward to her by various experts and cabinet ministers and MPs within her own party. And these were the specific proposals that she did support. For instance, she was an avid supporter of reforestation, greater energy efficiency, and scientific modelling. Again, in 1989, she claimed, "Even if we cannot fully or accurately assess the risk of climate change, I believe that we now must take some very important precautionary measures." She emphasized Immanuel Kant when she said that it is often necessary to make a decision on the basis of knowledge sufficient for action, but insufficient to satisfy the intellect. Let us therefore do what makes sense in any event, such as conserving tropical rainforests and improving energy efficiency. In parallel, we must also intensify our scientific efforts to model and predict climate change. Therefore, she definitely was a proponent of these three proposals. In addition, as I sort of mentioned previously, she was also a big fan of increased nuclear power. Speaking in the House of Commons in April 1989, for instance, she declared, "Nuclear power is one of the surest ways of maintaining economic development without damaging the environment." Thirdly, she was also strongly supportive of the plans to strengthen UNEP rather than develop any new international organisation that would hinder Britain's economic and hers Thatcherite goals. She wanted this on the basis of sound. She only wanted this, however, on the basis of sound science and sound economics, and would push forward to build a strong economic framework for international action if these credentials were met. Having been supportive of all these measures, however, it is important to state, however, that she was strongly against any policy that promoted the implementation of a carbon tax. She said when the possible question of a carbon tax was put to her, she always pointed out that Britain already had very pretty high taxes on petrol and gasoline, and that they were being put up, and that they'd already been put up in the last budget. And other countries must have artificially cheap gasoline that leads to the extravagant use. Sorry, I messed that up a bit there. I'll just pitch back here and scroll there. But yeah, she went on to say, in regards to the proposal of a carbon tax, that Britain already have high taxes on petrol and gasoline, and they were put up in the last budget. Other countries must have artificially cheap gasoline, and that leads to extravagant use, while our policy leads to economical use. Thus, from an economic point of view, the carbon tax was going completely against her own economic agenda and Thatcherite goals. And it was these economic goals of the Thatcherite agenda and her resistance to a carbon tax which ultimately would go on to really play a factor in Britain's eventual policy that they did develop pertaining to climate change, which is what I will discuss now. Therefore, having detailed all the points that I've made throughout this wee video so far, What actual policies did the UK implement during these years pertaining to climate change? Well, this is what it did in a nutshell, basically. In 1990, Britain announced a commitment that they would stabilise CO2 levels at 1990 levels by the year 2005. In September 1990, they also granted planning permission to development of a nuclear power plant to be developed in Hinkley Point. In the 1988-1989 budget, Britain also allocated £4.8 million towards the development of renewable technologies such as wind tunnels and solar panels. A real big initiative that Britain did pursue at this time was increased modelling development. Thatcher's government really went big in this area. For instance, state funding for climate-related research initiatives in 1889 alone, for instance, totaled a staggering $153.5 million, with $15 million going towards climate modelling and process studies, $3 million towards satellite observation schemes, $0.5 million on climate impact and assessment initiatives, and a further $135 million being put towards the research and development of assessing possibilities of substituting fossil fuel burning initiatives with nuclear power energy. So big investment was made in this area. Furthermore, Thatcher's government also went on to establish Europe's first Centre for Climate Prediction and Research, the Hadley Centre, in 1990. Thus, it cannot be doubted that the UK at this time were big global influencers in this field. Next, it must be stressed as well that reforestation was also a big area in which the UK engaged in policy action and were a global leader in this area. In this respect, Thatcher's government in 1988, via the Farm Woodland Scheme, set in place targets to plant up to 12,000 to increase planting of trees by up to 12,000 hectares per year in order to stock up and lock up additional levels of carbon within British forests. That would be to combat climate change. Policymakers believe that this new target, which would increase Britain's tree planting potential up to 45,000 hectares per year, would play a small yet vital role in combating the greenhouse effect, because it would lock up 4 million tonnes of carbon per year by the year 2005, as opposed to just 2.9 million tonnes if existing targets remained unchecked. Furthermore, not only in 1990 did the government commit 100 million over 3 years to Brazil to protect the Amazon rainforest, but between 1987 and 1990, Britain was also a major contributor to the Tropical Forest Action Plan, an international organisation that attempted to lock up carbon within rainforests and encourage the ways and sustainable use of forest resources within developing countries. Therefore, it cannot be doubted that reforestation was a major initiative taken on under Thatcher's government. And finally, especially in relation to international measures, the UK did go on to play a vital role in strengthening existing UNEP institutions. Not only did Britain, via Dr. John Houghton, chair Working Group 1 of the IPCC, which specialised in scientific assessments of the climate, but Thatcher's government went on to play a core role in financially propping up the organisation in the future, with statistics from the IPCC showing that Britain, by the year 1989, were the organisation's second biggest donor, behind only the USA, supplying the organisation with £35,000. Britain would also, during the IPCC's discussions, would also act as intermediaries between any countries who were having dialogue or friction pertaining to climate change initiatives. This shows that there was the development of a distinct set of climate change policies during Thatcher's third administration, which shows there was a vivid movement to curtail climate change at this time. Having said that, however, it must be acknowledged that in many areas at this time, Britain did lag behind other countries pertaining to climate change measures and initiatives. For instance, pertaining to Britain's goal of basically freezing their CO2 levels, other countries went further. For instance, Austria in 1988 committed to at least a 20% reduction in CO2 by the year 2000. Germany in 1987 targeted a 25% reduction by 2005. Australia and Denmark committed in 1988 to a 20% reduction in emissions by 2005, whilst the Netherlands in 1989 set themselves a target of reducing emissions by 3 to 5% by the year 2000. Therefore, these countries were actually committing themselves to a reduction rather than a stabilisation. Furthermore, in addition to these countries, other countries who actually also set themselves stabilisation targets of emissions, most of them, including Italy and Norway, not only took this decision before the UK did, but all of them also targeted the year 2000 as the year for stabilisation, rather than the year 2005, which was set by the UK. Moreover, in 1989 alone, only 1.5% of Britain's electricity, or 0.5% of Britain's total fuel consumption, was made from renewable energy sources such as wave or hydro power. This contrasted heavily to other industrialised countries at this time, with many investing significant resources into renewable energy as a possible solution to abate climate change. Not only did Sweden's National Energy Research Commission in May 1989, for example, develop and successfully test a new approach to harnessing wave energy for electric power generation, but 2 wave power plants were already in operation at this time within Norway, in line with wider governmental attempts to reduce global warming. The use of these renewable energy technologies not only meant that Sweden and Norway were increasing CO2 emissions at a far slower rate than the UK's, but meant that they were actually seen as champions moving forward for climate change abatement. Furthermore, Thatcher's government also failed to impose any type of regulatory carbon tax for fossil fuels, a measure which was introduced in countries including Finland, the Netherlands, Sweden, and Norway, especially in 1990. The data also showed that the Conservatives, instead of increasing finance and measures in renewable energy area, actually weakened and reversed existing energy efficiency policies and practices already in place. For instance, in 1988, the budget slashed the EEO's funding from 26 million per annum to 15 million a year from 1989, further decreasing to 12 million from 1990. It also removed the EEDS of its £69 loft insulation grant and replaced them with a new best practice programme that utilised industry and especially the privatisation of the private sector to encourage fuel and energy within domestic and commercial sectors. So it cut back on these areas big time, and we're pitching neoliberal ideals by putting out such areas to the private sector. All this eventually meant that spending per head per Britain at this time on renewable energy totaled 0.74 cents per head in Britain, whilst In comparison to other countries, it was $1.30 in France, $3.60 in Denmark, and $4.89 in Japan. Therefore, Britain, it cannot be doubted that pertaining to their climate change policies at this time and measures, Britain were definitely lagging behind others. Therefore, summing everything up, climate change policy under Thatcher did emerge as an important and progressive area during her third administration. This was due to a combination of scientific evidence, environmental activism, political developments, and international pressures to push the initiative onto the agenda. Margaret Thatcher also played a key role in shaping the policy response to climate change, but her motives and her values, also heavily influenced by neoliberalism, would also play a pivotal role in what type of climate policies were initially enacted by Britain at this stage. In short, her views were heavily dictated by the economy rather than anything else, much like all the other areas she was interested in. It was economy first. Moving forward at this stage, Britain's climate change policies under Thatcher's included an impressive reforestation programme and playing an increased role in a revamped UNEP. And although they did enact various other climate change policies, their measures often lagged behind other countries at this time, which meant it can be concluded that at this stage they cannot really be considered climate leaders in regards to climate change policies, especially those pertaining to renewable energies. Well, there you go, folks. That was the first episode, so to speak, of Uncharted Histories. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope it may have enlightened you to a period of history that you mightn't really have known about, especially related to Thatcher. But it also showcases the type of history that I'm going to be covering, unknown histories like this moving forward. So yeah, let me know your feedback on it, and once again, what topics should I pursue next? Anything's could be on the agenda. Could be Irish history, could be gender history, could be more Thatcher history, could be German history, American history, religious history, any type of history you can imagine. Drop a comment down below and I'll try my best to get something sorted. But yeah, folks, thanks very much for watching, and I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you next time.